Chapter 2, the Mediterranean Middle East. By the 5th and 6th centuries CE, societies of the Mediterranean Middle East essentially comprised Christian and to some extent Jewish populations, like the societies of the Mesopotamian region. The societies of the Mediterranean Middle East have a history long predating the rise of Christianity. Indeed, the Christian societies of this region were heir to such a diversity of cultures that it would be impossible to review them comprehensively here. In the following survey, I will review salient features of the mores of only some cultures of the area, those of Byzantine society as the dominant imperial power in the eastern Mediterranean, and those of classical Greece and ancient Egypt as two other major cultures of the region. My survey concludes with a review of the practices and ethos of early Christianity in the eastern Mediterranean in the period immediately preceding the Arab conquests. As already suggested, ideas fundamental to Christianity, the intrinsic value of the individual, the equal spiritual worth of men and women, and slaves and masters, and the superiority of virginity even to wifely obedience, in some ways subverted ideas fundamental to the reigning patriarchies of the age. Indeed, the mere notion that virginity was superior to reproductiveness undercut the idea that women's bodies and their reproductive capacity define the limits of their duties and proper aspirations. The subversiveness of these ideas, however, with respect to Christian as well as non-Christian formulations of male dominance, was mainly discreet and implicit. A few women were able to invoke the Christian ideals of virginity and celibacy to gain control over their lives. Elaine Pagels and others have pointed out that celibacy, or renouncing the world, offered women immediate rewards on earth, not just rewards in heaven. Women were able to use the ideas of celibacy and world renunciation, Pagels observes, to retain control of their own wealth, travel freely throughout the world as holy pilgrims, devote themselves to intellectual pursuits, and found institutions which they could personally direct. For the majority of women, however, such paths were not available. And despite this potentially liberating element in Christian thought, the mores determining the lives of Byzantine and other women of the Eastern Mediterranean in the early Christian era, at least on the level of the normative ideal, were thoroughly restrictive. The study of Byzantine women is still a new and developing field. The account offered by Grosdidier de Matons, one of the few authors to attempt an overview, describes Moors' lifestyles and attitudes toward women that are commonly associated with Muslim rather than Christian societies. Thus, as de Matons notes, citing Michael Psellos, an 11th century Byzantine author and political figure, the birth of a boy was greeted with cries of joy, but not that of a girl. Daughters and even sons could be betrothed in infancy, and girls generally married by the age of 12 or 13. Middle and upper class girls were taught to read, write, count, and sing, but their education was generally rudimentary compared to that of their brothers. Proper conduct for girls entailed that they would be neither heard nor seen outside their home. Women were not supposed to be seen in public and were kept as cloistered as prisoners. Although women and young girls might be allowed to leave the house to attend marriages, births, or religious events, or go to public baths, barring some general disaster, women were always supposed to be veiled, the veil or its absence marking the distinction between the honest woman and the prostitute. To exemplify how rigidly Byzantine society viewed the veiling and seclusion of women, de Matons again cites Psellos, who, writing in praise of his mother, observed that she raised her veil in the presence of men for the first time in her life when, at her daughter's funeral, she was too distraught to care that she did so. Psellos also commended the Caesaressa Irene for so scrupulously observing the imperative of concealing the flesh that she covered even her hands, like some zealous Muslim women of today who have taken to wearing gloves. Another Byzantine patrician of the 10th century, defending his daughter's custom of going to the baths, explained that he made sure that she only went out veiled and suitably chaperoned. The system of using eunuchs to enforce the separation of the sexes and to guard the enclosed world of women was fully in place. The only occupations regarded as proper for women were those that she might undertake in the home, spinning, weaving, and other activities involved in making cloth. Paradoxically, as one student of Byzantine society has remarked, the strict segregation was effectively kept women apart from men other than their immediate family, also created openings for women. Every institution for women, such as the public bath, required female attendants, and the existence of women midwives and doctors further reflected the societal belief that it was improper for men to attend to feminine bodily matters. The preceding two paragraphs might, without modification, describe the normative ideals and the practices of the middle and upper classes of Muslim societies of the Middle East from about the 8th century to the 18th. A study of Byzantine women by Angeliki Laiu notes that the enormous emphasis on reproduction undoubtedly correlates in part with the high infant mortality rate. Laiu also argues that the view of Byzantine women as isolated and secluded has been overemphasized because of the weight given to the written accounts of such famous figures as Psellos. The active economic role of women presupposes a general involvement in the society and a much rather greater interaction with men than scholars have believed, and thus the functional reality, Laiu argues, differed from the ideal. Byzantine women, as she points out, were active not only as bath attendants, midwives, and doctors, but also as artisans and sellers of foodstuffs. Women also engaged in retail and long-distance trade and lent and invested money. Indeed, historians are noting the same kinds of facts with respect to Muslim women in societies and pointing out that the ideals of seclusion and invisibility were by no means fully realized as social reality. But ideals, even though undercut by economic and functional exigencies, are nevertheless an important and influential component of the system of meanings determining the psychosocial experience of being for both women and men. In addition to their impact on the real but often intangible domains of psychosocial experience, they constitute part of the conceptual ground upon which laws relating to marriage, divorce, property, and other matters are based. And indeed, in matters of law as well as the social ideal, there are parallels between Byzantine and Islamic legal thought. The Byzantine law, limiting a woman's right to testify on matters relating directly to women, such as childbirth, which women rather than men were likely to witness, for example, has its parallel in Islamic law. Not uncommonly, students of Byzantine society attribute the oppressive custom toward women to Oriental influences. Indeed, the Greeks and Byzantines did borrow some such customs from the Persians. For example, Alexander's decision to keep a harem the same size as that of the Persian king he had conquered. Still, Greek society, the most direct antecedent of Byzantine society, also had a well-developed system of male dominance, which was also oppressive toward women. Pre-Christian Greek societies, and in particular classical Greek societies, are among the few in this region in which women's lives have been systematically studied. In outlining some salient features of classical Greek society, I have focused on customs regarding women that show continuity with the Byzantine customs just described, which indeed were probably in some degree common to the major urban centers of the Eastern Mediterranean in the early Christian era, including those of Syria and Egypt. Free women in Athens in the classical period, 500 to 323 BCE, according to Sarah Pomeroy, were usually secluded so that they could not be seen by men who were not close relatives. An orator could maintain that some women were even too modest to be seen by men who were mere relatives, and for a strange man to intrude upon free women in the house of another man was tantamount to a criminal act. Men and women led separate lives, men spending most of their days in public areas, such as the marketplace and the gymnasium, while respectable women stayed at home. Women were expected to confine themselves to the quarters and to manage the household, care for small children and servants, and supervise the weaving and cooking. Architecturally speaking, the sexes were segregated in separate quarters, with women inhabiting the rooms away from the street and from the public area of the house. Their clothing concealed them from the eyes of strange men. A shawl was worn that could be drawn over the head as a hood. The qualities admired in girls were silence and submissiveness. Orators praised women for their silence and invisibility and avoided mentioning the names of respectable women who were still alive. Infanticide, particularly of females, was probably practiced on occasion. According to Aristotle, the purpose of marriage and the function of women was to provide heirs. Under Athenian law, a female heir was required to marry the next of kin on her father's side, even if she was already married, to produce a male heir for her father's oikos, family house. Athenian law regarded the wife as a veritable child, having the legal status of a minor relative to her husband. Males came of age at 18, females never did. They could not buy or sell land, but could acquire property by gift or inheritance, even though such property was administered by male guardians. They did not even go to market for food because of the belief that purchase or exchange was a financial transaction too complex for women, and because of the wish to protect women from the eyes of strangers. Aristotle's theories conceptualized women not merely as subordinate by social necessity, but also as innately and biologically inferior in both mental and physical capacities, and thus as intended for their subservient position by nature. He likened the rule of men over women to the rule of the soul over the body, and of the mind and the rational element over the passionate. The male, he said, is by nature superior, and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. Man's nature is the most rounded off and complete. Women is more compassionate, but also more jealous, more querulous, more apt to scold and strike, more void of shame and self-respect, more false of speech, more deceptive. These moral and mental differences were paralleled by biological ones. Thus Aristotle saw female bodies as defective, women being, as it were, an impotent male, for it is though through a certain incapacity that the female is female. The female contribution to conception was inferior. The male contributed the soul and gave form to the secretion of the female, which merely provided the material mass. Aristotle's influence was widespread and enduring. His theories, in effect, codified and systematized the social values and practices of that society. They were presented, however, as objective, scientific observations, and were received by both Arab and European civilizations, or by major figures within these civilizations, as the articulation of eternal philosophical and scientific verities. During the subsequent Hellenistic Empire, women's position in Hellenistic societies outside Athens improved. This improvement is thought to reflect not only Athenian interaction with other Greek societies that were less restrictive toward women, but also the influence of other Mediterranean cultures on the Greek. The best documented and most studied example of this improved status is that of Greek women in Egypt, which was a province of the Hellenistic Empire at the time, Pomeroy, who devotes an entire work to their study, points to numerous ways in which these women were freer and treated more equally in law than women had been during any previous period in Greece. Greek women were not secluded in Egypt, though Greek tradition would discourage them from business contacts with strange men. In contrast, the traditions affecting Egyptian women did not inhibit them from associating with men. 154, pointing out differences between Greek and Egyptian laws. For instance, Greek law required women to act through male guardians, and Egyptian law regarded women as capable of acting on their own behalf. Pomeroy notes that the status of Greek women slowly improved, either because Greek laws were altered along the lines of Egyptian ones, or because Greek women chose to enter into contracts according to Egyptian law. 119 to 20. Similar changes occurred in marriage contracts, making them far more favorable for women. For example, husbands were forbidden to be polygamous, were contractually bound not to entertain mistresses, concubines, or bored lovers, and were required to return dowries and pay fines for divorcing their wives without just cause. Women enjoyed the same rights to terminate marriages as did men. 97-94. Broadly, Pomeroy finds that there was less distinction between the genders in Ptolemaic Egypt than there was, for example, in Athens or in Greek society in general of an earlier period. Parallels can be found scattered elsewhere, but no other Greek society of the Hellenistic period provides a comparable quantity and variety of documentation for women's increased participation in the economy and the improvement of their economic status. 173. Whereas Athenian democracy was based on the oikos, in which the female's role was the production of heirs, in Ptolemaic Egypt, according to Pomeroy, there was no political concept of the oikos. A shared life rather than reproduction was the purpose of marriage. That's 18. In further contrast, she notes there is little overt reference in Ptolemaic Egypt to the production of children as women's primary contribution to the domestic economy. 72. Unfortunately, Pomeroy compares Greek and Egyptian customs only in passing and never addresses the broad subject of the influence of the more egalitarian Egyptian laws and customs on Greek ones. Her resolute avoidance of a direct discussion of the subject is striking, given its centrality to her topic and findings. In another omission, she deals only with the Greeks in Egypt, although the works of other scholars such as Dorothy Thompson and Naphtali Lewis show that it is quite possible to work solely through Greek language sources and still take both the Egyptian and the Greek populations into account. These omissions are particularly unfortunate in that they result in the invisibility of non-Europeans and in the glossing over of the more humane and egalitarian laws of the colonized non-Europeans as compared to those of their European overlords. And consequently, they also contribute to the endorsement of an Orientalist construct of the past and the origins, history, and the nature of European civilization, especially in relation to African and Oriental civilizations. As is clear, even from Pomeroy's tangential references, Egyptian attitudes and laws regarding women at the time of the Greek conquest and for some time thereafter were remarkably liberal and egalitarian. As with ancient Greece, Egypt is one of the few civilizations of the region that has been studied by a number of scholars with respect to women, though studies to date are generally descriptive rather than analytic. In a recent extended study of women in ancient Egypt, Jean Vercoteur unequivocally asserts it is beyond all doubt that the Egyptians never had any prejudice against the weak sex. Speaking specifically of the Middle Kingdom, 2060 to 1785 BCE, Vercoteur observes Man did not consider himself a priori as in essence superior. Consciousness of the equality of the sexes is profoundly anchored in Egyptian beliefs, and it was doubtless this which was to permit the progressive emancipation of women in the ensuing centuries of the New Kingdom. Writing of a New Kingdom, 1570 to 950 BCE, document, he says, "In this text, the absolute equality before the law of the man and the woman appear clearly. Doubtless this equality is at the source of the general belief in the privileged position of the woman in Egypt in comparison with the feminine condition in other civilizations of antiquity, and this deserves to be examined more closely. The ancient Egyptian civilization endured for several millennia, from circa 3100 BC to the Greek conquest in 333 BCE, and throughout the period the status of women naturally did not remain static, although their position possibly declined during the Middle Kingdom and was at its best during the New Kingdom. The culture by and large accorded women high esteem and was remarkably non-misogynist. By the time of the New Kingdom, the laws governing marriage and the rights to inherit, own, and manage property were pronouncedly egalitarian. All the evidence suggests, it says Christiane de Roche's Noble Court, that juridically women were equal to men. For instance, women had the right to own, administer, and dispose of property, buy and sell, inherit and pass on property, testify in court, and act in all matters directly and without intermediary. Marriage was monogamous, except for the pharaohs. It was a contract between the parties concerned and could therefore include conditions such as the one included in an extant marriage contract between two workers dating from the New Kingdom, which stipulates that the husband would be liable to 100 lashes and the loss of his property should he beat his wife. Both parties had the right to divorce, women being entitled to take the property with them in that event. Marriage and divorce alike were private agreements in which the state took no part and no ceremonies were necessary or even available to sanction a marriage in religion or law. The state appears to have regulated sexuality only to ensure public order. A point adduced by the Egyptologist C.J. Iyer on the basis of Ramses III's claim that the woman of Egypt could go about wherever she wanted without being molested on the road. The state also interceded in the punishment of adultery in the interest, Iyer argues, of public order and the restriction of vendetta, because the evidence suggests that an adulterer caught in the act might expect to be killed on the spot by the enraged husband. Noble Court and Bercotier report that the penalty for adultery fell equally on both sexes, though they give examples of penalties affecting a man with whom a wife committed adultery, not penalties for a husband committing adultery. Iyer suggests that it can perhaps be presumed that copulation with an unmarried and willing woman was of relatively neutral implication socially and legally. He also makes the remarkable statement that actual evidence for prostitution in the New Kingdom is slight. Women were neither veiled nor secluded, and they could socialize freely. Noble Court and Bercotier give numerous examples of women's autonomy, economic activity, and fair treatment in law, and the enormously positive and even dominant role of female deities, in particular Hathor and Isis, and of priestesses who commanded great respect and high salaries. Similarly, both authors, especially Noble Court, give detailed accounts of the prestige of queens and even of the pharaoh's spouses and female relatives. As the example of the marriage contract suggests, worker-class women, as well as women of the more privileged property classes, benefited from the egalitarian spirit of their laws, of the laws. Nevertheless, it should be noted that only women of the more privileged classes benefited from the property laws, and that the society included slaves, a group that did not benefit from any of these laws. The situation of women of the property-owning classes in Egypt thus appears to have been thoroughly anomalous in this region and time period. Evidently, Egypt was a male-dominated society, as the institution of kingship, the absence of women from administrative positions, and the domination of certain professions by men. Women were rarely scribes, all make plain. Women, though equal in some areas, were also excluded from others. Still, male dominance was apparently not accompanied by misogyny or by laws systematically and comprehensively privileging men and oppressing women. That is, misogyny and the systematic oppression of women do not naturally result from male dominance once urban societies develop. Although studies of the evolution and development of patriarchies and of patterns of male dominance, including Lerner's study, implicitly assume a necessary, perhaps even inevitable, relation between them. Pomeroy and Noblecourt both mention details that could be analytically telling. For example, that the Egyptian state took no direct part in marriage and divorce and did not regulate the family, and that unlike the Greek conception, the purpose of marriage among Egyptians was apparently not the production of heirs for the patriarchal head of household, but the shared life and the pleasures and comforts it had to offer. This observation by Pomeroy is supported by an Egyptian adage quoted by Noblecourt, advising men not to divorce women because they had not conceived a better solution, being, the adage advises, to consider adoption. Why male dominance took such an apparently benign course in Egypt compared to the course it took in Greece and Mesopotamia, and why it was the misogynist and oppressive models for treating women that eventually won over the entire region culturally and intellectually, and not the more benevolent and egalitarian models, are both questions deserving further attention. The rights and egalitarian conditions enjoyed by Egyptian women shocked the conquering Greeks, says Vercudia. He observes that as Greek and Roman mores and laws spread, Egyptian women lost most of their rights. A number of points here are noteworthy. First, the decline of the position and rights of women in Egypt occurred under the influence of European dominance and laws. Second, this decline occurred long before Egypt was conquered by the Arabs and was apparently in place in the Christian era. Third, as we shall see, the laws that took shape under Islam in the centuries immediately after the Muslim conquest, far from bringing about an improvement for women, as is commonly claimed, constituted rather a further lamentable regression for Egyptian women and for the spirit of egalitarianism, humaneness, and justice. But it is also relevant to emphasize that although Islamic laws marked a distinct decline, a Greek, a Roman, and a Christian period had already brought about major losses in women's rights and status. In effect, Islam merely continued a restrictive trend already established by the successive conquerors of Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. In inheriting the Moors that by the time of the Arab conquest had become the Moors of the dominant Christian population, Islam accepted what was deeply consonant with its own patterns of male dominance. Islam then did not bring radical change, but a continuity and accentuation of the lifestyles already in place. Evidence dating from the early Christian era, such as the representations of Syrian women in garments concealing them from head to foot, and the wealth of misogynist Christian literature, points to the entrenchment of negative attitudes toward women in early Mediterranean Christianity. Christianity did carry the seed of a radical social and sexual egalitarianism, and its valuation of virginity allowed some women, as noted earlier, to defy the patriarchal authority of other religions, to claim an inner worth that transcended and even negated the primacy of their biological worth as reproducers, and to gain some autonomy in their lives. Still, it cannot be assumed that the spread of Christianity necessarily spelled a general improvement for women, or that it necessarily brought about a more favorable order for women than would have pertained under the other universalist religions popular at the time in the Mediterranean world. Two of the popular religions were based on the worship of the goddess Isis and, to a lesser extent, the goddess Ishtarta, of Egyptian and Syrian origin, respectively. They spread throughout the Mediterranean, including Greece and Rome, but were mostly deeply rooted in Egypt and the Middle East. Both goddesses were served by priestesses as well as priests. Some studies suggest that Middle Eastern Christianity had a more positive and liberal view of women and permitted them more active roles in the church than Imperial Roman and Byzantine Christianity, possibly because of the rootedness of goddess worship and women's temple service. Early on, for example, Syrian and Egyptian Christianity emphasized the female aspect of the Godhead, God the Father and Mother, in ways that appeared heretical to the dominant Imperial Christianity and were eventually outlawed by that church. Similarly, the active role allowed women in the Eastern Church was later curtailed. Politically dominant Christianity brought with it not only an implicit radical egalitarianism, but also the patriarchal ideas of its originary Judaism, and with these, the religious sanction of women's social subordination and the endorsement of their essential secondariness through, for example, the biblical account of Eve's creation from Adam's rib. Jewish patriarchal ideas and regulations regarding women were related to ideas that developed in Mesopotamia, where the Hebrews probably originated. The cultural influence of Mesopotamia was also important in Palestine, where the Hebrews later settled. Judaism, in the period preceding and around the time of the rise of Christianity, permitted polygamy, concubinage, and unrestricted divorce for men, and did not allow women to inherit or to play a role in religion. To mention only some salient features, some of these mores were accepted by Christianity, others, polygamy, for example, were not. Jewish feminists have argued, perhaps with some justification, that Christians have tended to scapegoat Judaism as the source of Christian misogyny. It would appear, for instance, that in terms of conceptualizing women's inferiority, the Greeks, as exemplified by Aristotle's reasoning in the 4th century BCE, had nothing to learn from the Hebrews. Thus, it is possible that the Hellenization of the Mediterranean, the military, political, and cultural dominance of Greece and Rome, were at least as important to the assimilation of misogyny and oppressive mores by Christianity as the Judaic heritage. After all, Christianity rejected other ideas fundamental to Judaism, so why not Jewish misogyny? To identify Judaism as the sole or even principal source of misogyny among Christians not only risks being simplistic and inaccurate, but also evades the fundamental question of why such negative definitions of women found ready acceptance in this region at this time. Whatever the cultural sources, a fierce misogyny was a distinct ingredient of Mediterranean and eventually Christian thought in the centuries immediately preceding the rise of Islam. One form it took in the pre-Christian era was female infanticide. The practice of infanticide, predominantly of girls, predated Christianity and was followed by the Greeks and the Romans. Greek and Roman authors reported it as a custom of their compatriots, but not of such aliens as the Egyptians and the Jews. In the early Christian era, it was also practiced in Arabia, where it was later banned under Islam. Among the Romans, the discarding, though through exposure of female infants, was even implicitly codified in the law. Fathers were required to raise all their sons, but only one daughter. Because infanticide was common among the Roman aristocracy, it was evidently not related to material need. Christianity was to view abortion and even contraception as sinful. In the 6th century, the Justinian Code of Law defined abortion as homicide, developments that may have curbed infanticide. The Church's attitude on abortion and contraception, however, formed part of a broader negative ethos concerning the body and sexuality, a sense of these as sinful and shameful, and of sexualities legitimate only for procreation. The consequences for women were especially opprobrious in that they were evidently perceived as innately more implicated in physicality and sexuality than men. The shamefulness of sex was focused mostly intensely on the shamefulness of the female body, which had to be totally concealed. The Syrian reliefs showing a woman so heavily swathed that no part of her, not even hands or face, is uncovered, date from the early Christian era. And such ideas also meant that men had to avoid contact with women, even flee from them. Merely seeing a woman represented a danger, and therefore the veil, concealing clothing, and strict segregation became increasingly emphasized. The fanatical repudiation of physicality and sexuality and of women as their quintessential representation found expression in a patristic literature that developed to the full the misogynist possibilities of the Bible. The writings of such church fathers as Augustine, Origen, and Tertullian, for example, reflect the concept of the female as inferior, secondary, defined entirely by her biology and useless to man, and worse, as causing sexual temptation, corruption, and evil. Augustine, for instance, pondering the mystery of why God had created woman, considered that he had created her neither as man's companion, for another man would have filled this role better, nor as his helper, for again another man would have been more appropriate. He concluded, I fail to see what use woman can be to man if one excludes the function of bearing children. He said women were also a source of sexual temptation. More relentless in his misogyny, Tertullian wrote of woman, you are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of the forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. On account of your desert, that is, death, even the Son of God had to die. Islam, arising in the 7th century CE, explicitly identified itself as a monotheism in the tradition of Judaism and Christianity, indeed as a renewal of those faiths, because at the time of the Muslim conquest, the region was dominated by a Christian church that, to some extent, had legitimized and justified misogyny by reference to biblical stories that Islam either openly or implicitly recognized as divinely revealed. The new religion could incorporate seamlessly an already developed scriptural misogyny into the socio-religious universe it too would inscribe. In the introduction, I noted that specialist disciplines and self-contained histories dealing with ancient civilizations, all within the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean region, had the effect of emphasizing their separateness and obscuring or erasing interconnections and continuities. Certain elements mentioned in the preceding pages, such as the tendency to attribute Byzantine seclusion to Oriental influences and to distance the oppression of women from European societies and represent it as originating among non-Europeans, suggest yet other barriers to understanding. In particular, they suggest that ideology and nationalism continue to play a role in the writing of history, and they indicate the need to develop an integrated approach free of racial and nationalist bias in the exploration of this crucial period in human history. Nor is it only the Western world that develops historical constructs to serve vested political and ideological interests. Islamic civilization developed a construct of history that labeled the pre-Islamic period the age of ignorance and projected Islam as the sole source of all that was civilized, and used that construct so effectively in its rewriting of history that the peoples of the Middle East lost all knowledge of the past civilizations of the region. Obviously, that construct was ideologically serviceable, successfully concealing, among other things, the fact that in some cultures of the Middle East, women had been considerably better off before the rise of Islam than afterward. Knowledge of the past was eventually recovered through the endeavors of Western scholars in search of the roots ironically not of Islamic civilizations, but of Western civilization. The Western construct of Western civilization as the direct inheritor of the civilizations of the ancient Middle East, and the concomitant Western construct of Islamic civilization as disinherited from that past, or at least not its direct heir, a construct coinciding with the one that Islamic historiography created, still underlies many college courses and textbooks. Thus, brief accounts of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations frequently figure in Western courses and textbooks on the history of Western civilization, generally without acknowledgement that Islamic civilization has the same foundation, but they do not figure in courses and textbooks on the history of Islamic civilization. Feminist works may also replicate this perspective, as does, for example, Gerda Lerner's Creation of Patriarchy.